So I went to the Melbourne International Film Festival the other night and saw a really good Korean movie called Burning. It's directed by Lee Chang-Dong, and it's an adaptation of a Japanese short story by Murakami. The short story is called Barn Burning.
이종수.
I found it really engaging, really interesting. It was just a great, emotional story, but it also had a lot of really interesting and kind of complicated and ambiguous ideas. So I wanted to have a go at getting some of those ideas down to try and kind of clarify them for myself, because there was a lot of confusing, conflicted ideas and a lot of ambiguity all throughout Burning, in its themes and its plot and its characters. Yeah, a lot of kind of duality and ambiguity. So I thought I'd go through one at a time the kind of key themes that really I thought were interesting in Burning. The first one is that very idea of oppositions, of kind of duality or contradiction. The main three oppositions that I think are at play throughout Burning are absence versus presence, so whether something's there or not, fiction versus truth, so whether something's real or not, and subjectivity versus objectivity, so the way our perspective affects things. The difference between the way we see something and the way it actually is objectively. Now, though Burning overall is much less fantastical than many of Murakami's works, Murakami's known for kind of magical realism and some kind of real sci-fi, it does involve a number of intriguing oppositions and paradoxes that touch on the surreal. In an early scene, Haimi mimes eating a tangerine, and she explains that the key to this mime is not to pretend the tangerine is there, but to forget that it isn't. This moment raises the ideas of doubt, skepticism, and a strange ambiguity that remains throughout the rest of Burning, and I think are central to understanding the themes and even the plot of Burning. Then Jong-soo is tasked with feeding Haimi's cat, Boyle. But having seen her eat a non-existent tangerine, he jokes that maybe Boyle too is made up, is unreal. He soon discovers evidence of the cat, but can't find it for sure in her apartment. Haimi later divulges an apparently important childhood memory of falling down a well, from which Jong-soo apparently rescued her. Jong-soo, however, does not recall this, nor can he find the well on her old property. The present tenant says he doesn't think there was a well there, nor does Haimi's family. Jong-soo's mother, however, does recall there being a well, so this, like many of the uncertain plot elements throughout Burning, is not resolved with any certainty. As Jong-soo says, this world is mysterious. The antagonist of Burning 2, Ben, is a figure of intriguing uncertainty and contradictions. Ben is a young man of wealth, but doesn't appear to work. When asked what he does, he says Jong-soo wouldn't understand, but in an attempt to explain, says that he plays for a living. So in Ben, we have another pair of oppositions, work and play. He's pleasant, but also cold. He explains that he's never cried and finds it a curious behaviour in others. When visiting Jong-soo's home, Ben casually admits to being an arsonist, explaining that he burns down greenhouses every few months. He reveals that he plans to destroy one very near Jong-soo's house soon. Jong-soo tirelessly checks all the nearby greenhouses daily, but finds no evidence of their destruction. However, this search too is also paradoxical and ambiguous. As with the search for Haimi's well, he's essentially searching for the presence of something which is by nature an absence. A well is an interesting thing to search for because, as a whole, it is defined by its absence or lack. Ben explains about his greenhouses that once he's destroyed them, it's as if they were never there. So as with the well, Jong-soo is kind of searching for nothing. So it's kind of a fruitless endeavour. Jong-soo may have seen a destroyed greenhouse in seeing an empty patch of land, but just not known it. When challenged, Ben says that Jong-soo must have missed it in his search, and that sometimes things are difficult to see because they're too close to you. So here we have another paradox, another pair of opposites. This image of searching too far for something that is too close to see. The skepticism about the existence of Haimi's cat is perhaps an allusion to Schrodinger's cat. Now, I don't know much about quantum mechanics. I'm sure there are plenty of better YouTube videos explaining that. But the little I know is that I think it's a thought experiment that illustrates a notion in quantum mechanics that something, like an atom or a photon, can be in multiple different states simultaneously. In Schrodinger's thought experiment, there is a cat within a box which is both alive and dead at once until it's observed from the outside. And even Einstein, in his letters with Schrodinger about this issue of quantum mechanics, also used this example of an unstable keg of gunpowder which could be both exploded and not exploded simultaneously. Now, both of these examples remind of Lee Chang-Dong's use of this presence-absence of an exploded greenhouse to explore this idea of doubt, paradox, and duality. So it seems somehow relevant, this idea of multiple contradictory states simultaneously, and even using explicitly a cat and the idea of explosion and an invisible explosion as examples of that. The three central characters of Burning are very different from one another, and their relationships to this notion of contradiction or paradox are also distinct. Jong-soo, as our protagonist, observes and investigates these ambiguities. When asked what the story of his novel in progress is, he concludes, to me the world is a mystery. Hae-mi produces many of these doubts, performing mimes, telling stories of faraway places and people, and herself disappearing mysteriously. So she's kind of the catalyst for, or the trigger of these doubts. Where, as I say, Jong-soo is the investigator, the observer. Ben, on the other hand, is the antagonist of the story, but also the character who talks most directly about these issues. He tells of his experiences with and theorizes on the topics of paradox, contradiction, and duality. He ponders the possibility of being in Baju and in Africa simultaneously. Okay, the second kind of major theme or topic that interested me throughout Burning is the idea of heredity, inheritance, and repetition, a kind of fatalistic repetition. Repeating patterns and inheritance of family traits seem to be important throughout Burning's narrative. The past, present, and future seem to flatten out as Jong-soo's memories blend with his present experiences, and seem to predict the future. In this way, it's kind of a postmodern or perhaps surrealist text, but as I said earlier, it's not explicitly sci-fi or surrealist. It just kind of hints at those things through dream sequences and characters philosophizing, and the doubts of not knowing everything seems to blur these lines and hint at a kind of surrealist element. Anyway, so Jong-soo tells Ben that his father's explosive anger pushed his mother out of their lives, after which they burned her clothes. When Ben tells Jong-soo about his immolation of greenhouses, Jong-soo has that night, I think, a dream that seems to blend the two, where he, as a boy, is observing with pleasure a burning greenhouse. So it's kind of blending his own memory with this new information about Ben destroying greenhouses. I think, unless I missed something about that scene, I think that's what it was, that dream sequence. Then, of course, the plot ultimately ends with the central woman, again in Jong-soo's life, like his mother, disappearing. Then an explosion of anger and the burning of clothes. So there's this repeating cycle. Ben also raises at a few points the idea of nature being a cold, deterministic force. On the drive back from the airport, he jokes to his own mother, appropriately, about his DNA, his superior DNA. Later, when explaining his arson, he remarks that it's not a moral behaviour, it's not moral or immoral, it's an amoral event, just a cold process that occurs like nature, like the rain falling. In many ways, Ben represents the cold, mechanical, amoral nature of humankind, acting on compulsion, seeking pleasures in a cyclical, mechanistic way. So there are kind of all these references to a kind of set, deterministic model of human behaviour. The third major theme or idea that I had when watching this film that I wanted to explore is this kind of Oedipal structure at play here. And this ties into the last point. This idea of repetition of a pattern across generations is a very ancient Greek Oedipal kind of narrative. So unlike Oedipus Rex, there's no literal incest or patricide, but there are many other elements of Greek tragedy and some hints at those kind of Oedipal events. Jong-soo seems to be at the mercy of greater powers, where in Greek tragedy that's often the gods or fate. Here, he's a victim of his social condition, and he's kind of at the mercy of this great metropolis soul and of the wealthy around him. He's often placed in contrast with Ben, and in that contrast, Jong-soo's lack of wealth and social influence and his lack of power is highlighted. Like his father before him, he seems fated to a particular life and doomed to frustration and failure. When inevitably beaten down by these things, he reacts in a pattern foreshadowed by his father. As a child, his father's nature caused the departure of his mother, of Jong-soo's mother, his father's wife. His father and he then burned their clothes, as I mentioned earlier, and as an adult, a powerful older figure, Ben, enters Jong-soo's world and removes from it, again, the most important woman in his life. Jong-soo reacts according to pattern and prediction, killing the father figure and burning the remains, burning his car, his body, and both of their clothes. Now, this produces, I think, the key or the best image of the film, the title image. And it's an image that's kind of been repeated throughout. And this image is Jong-soo childlike and ultimately naked at the mercy of his ancestry, of his parentage, and the fatalism that goes along with, compelled to be destructive and trying but failing to escape that fate, escape that scene. That's the final image. It's a sad one, and it's a foreshadowed one, and it's a repeating image of like the father, the son being pushed by fate or by nature or by genetics to violence. That final scene between Jong-soo and Ben doesn't seem to fit the Oedipal narrative strictly, in that there's no clear self-directed attack like Oedipus gouges out his eyes. The apparent story here is that, the story on the surface at least, is that Ben is a serial killer. This is possible, and it is suggested by the evidence, but like the story of the well and Ben's claims about the greenhouses and the cat, it's not certain. Another possibility is that Jong-soo's verbal attack, the last thing he said to Hae-mi, given her feelings for him and her loneliness and her financial difficulties, as Ben and her co-workers later inform us, all of that perhaps provoked her suicide. That's the other possibility. In this case, Jong-soo's ultimate explosion then is not of rage at Ben so much as an explosion of guilt about his own abusive behaviour, about his inability to escape, repetition of the sins of the father, loss of the mother, etc. Then, killing Ben is only one part of this final act. The other, perhaps equally important, is the removal and burning of his own clothes. As his father had him burn his mother's clothes, perhaps to destroy the past and the guilt associated with her, Jong-soo burning his clothes is a kind of attempted escape, but also a kind of rebirth from which he, as we see, emerges naked, purified, but we fear doomed to repeat the same cycle of repression and eruption of violence. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is the role of literature in burning. Literature and books and writing seem to play an important, if subtle, role throughout burning. Jong-soo is himself a struggling young writer, and he's often asked the question, what is your story, or what are you writing? The story he's trying to write and the story of the film Burning itself are often kind of paired, they're like parallel narratives. Jong-soo's attempt to write seems to be analogous with his attempt to understand the world around him. And for each, he doesn't have the answer yet. When his father's lawyer asks him what kind of writing he does, he says he's not sure. He doesn't really have an answer. When Ben asks him how his writing is going, later in the film, he says he doesn't yet know what to write about because he doesn't yet understand the world. So these two things are paired. His writing and the story of the film and our understanding of its world, of its story. Jong-soo also interprets elements of his world in literary terms. He describes to Amy Ben as the Great Gatsby, young, wealthy, mysterious. Jong-soo also tells Ben that William Faulkner is his favourite writer. Later we see Ben reading Faulkner. This also seems to exemplify their characters. Jong-soo, curious but unsure of himself, is struggling to write. Ben, pleasure-seeking and capable, consumes everything around him. Consumes a variety of ideas, people and things. So in summary, what is all this? All of these themes seem to be about ambiguity, doubt, contradiction and kind of paradox. But is there a point to them all? I don't really know. But I think if there is a point, it's that life is ambiguous. Life is, like Jong-soo says, mysterious. And our experience of the world is susceptible to illusion, doubt, and manipulation. And the resultant emotions and actions, they are real, at least. The explosions of violence, there's no doubt about them. They happen. And so that, this kind of combination of serious, impactful action, like violence, prompted by dubious evidence and subjective experience, makes that violence, seem all the more absurd and tragic.